I want people to truly wake up, to open their minds, to question everyone, every goddamn thing, and find their own truth and reality. And with Port Arthur, it's just a starting point. There are so many attributes to our society that are signposting an orchestration of the oppression and control of Australian society from woe to go. And we need to fight against it.
And look, I totally agree. And for people who would say, oh, Port Arthur, it's almost 30 years ago now. Who cares, blah, blah, blah. I would argue the complete opposite of that. I think it's important to honour the victims of those events. They deserve our respect. And I think respect means the pursuit of truth. But I also think traumatic events like that, they're like ripples in a pond. They send ripples through the fabric of society. And I think Port Arthur has sent great ripples through Australian society. I think it has weakened Australian society.
Welcome to the Wasp Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. Well, today I've got a very special guest here, Mr. David Thrussell, who is an icon of the subversive Australian music industry. He was the helmsman for the bands Snog and Soma back in the 90s, and continuing on with that tradition today, making music that is less than the mainstream, and that's in many ways what we're all about with a lot of our artistic endeavours. And so you've been around for a long time and had some very dizzying highs when it comes to the subversive music industry with a lot of semi-industrial ambience and music, I guess, that sort of shook up the Australian industry, which a lot of it needed to be shook up. And so here we are today, because I also understand that as well as that, you're a bit of an agent provocateur, and certainly looking at many of the aspects that are less than savoury of Australian culture and subculture. And also part of that is that you've dived fairly deeply into the Port Arthur Massacre, and that's why we're here today, to have a discussion about that. But we're also going to just talk generally, philosophically, about the zeitgeist of the Port Arthur Massacre, and just the notion of what it's done to Australia, where it came from initially, along with many of the other aspects that have changed Australian culture for the worse over decades. And certainly the Port Arthur Massacre was a pivotal moment, a change in an Australian perspective towards our own notions of our own resilience against government tyranny and draconian control. But we can talk about that in great detail. So welcome. Thanks for coming along to the Wasp Files.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for that. And I wanted to make a public thank you to you for doing the Wasp Files. I think you're doing vital work for Australia and the broader community. I think you're bringing out information that is really, really quite important for people to have access to. Some of that information, of course, has been available before, but it's hard for people to access. So I think you're doing a great job, as well as bringing out new information people haven't encountered before, but also asking deep questions about Port Arthur, which is exactly the right thing to do. And I wanted to add to that I know there are people who argue you should let sleeping dogs lie. I'm not one of those people, certainly not in this case. I think the most respectful thing that you can do for the victims of Port Arthur, the people who died horrific deaths and the people who were injured in Port Arthur, the most honourable and respectful thing you can do for those people is to attempt to bring out the truth of that event and, bring forth some kind of justice. And I do think it's plain to me, certainly from having watched a number of your episodes of the Wasp Files, that there's a great probability that the people who actually engineered and possibly carried out the Port Arthur Massacre have never faced justice. And I think that is a great insult to the victims of that event. And I think it is highly honourable, and it is honouring and respecting their memory to attempt to get to the bottom of it and attempt to seek the truth. So I just wanted to thank you for doing that.
Yeah, look, one thing that I despise is tokenism. And I'm certainly not about that. I've often said that this journey that I found myself on with Port Arthur is a grim and distressing journey. I never intended to find myself here. I wanted to make a film about Port Arthur, and still do and will do, as way back as 2016. But in the 9 years of intensive research into the tragedy and speaking to a lot of people, including the victims, some of whom have become friends of mine, it was important to me, and not on any superficial level at all, that I wanted people to have their say. I think that's a big thing. Most people, anyone that questions the more nefarious activities of our government, particularly if it affects them directly with trauma, and find themselves suddenly slipping between the cracks of this veneer of control that the Australian society superimposes over our existence, certainly finds themselves shocked to the core and feeling like that they have no justice, they have no truth, they have no recourse to be able to have their say, to be able to speak up in outrage and say, this was the way I was treated, why did this happen, why can't I get answers to the questions? And I found that that was in some ways one of the most distressing aspects of the aftermath of the Port Arthur Massacre, is people that should have had their say and never got their say. And of course, you know, the sanctioned media outlets such as the ABC provided an outlet to control that environment, and they had shows like I Was Actually There, where they interviewed, yes, direct survivors from Port Arthur, and first responders and police and so on, but there was a conspicuous absence of some of the people who had a profound loss during Port Arthur and who never had their say in court, and certainly were never invited to speak on those shows.
And I assume those people, those witnesses, were excluded, I assume, because what they had to say didn't fit that preordained narrative, did it? That's my assumption.
That's correct. And not all of them, but certainly these were people that were just ordinary people, that some of them were employees at the Port Arthur Historic Site, and they had a lot of things to say about the failure by the government to continue with the coronial inquest, because they were working on a government site, and their losses through loved ones and their own personal losses were ignored. And they were shocked and outraged that they couldn't say, hey, you know, we're part of the government here, we're working, and there should be all of these systems and processes in place to provide us with justice, recompense, and the means to be able to have our say. And that is one of the things that outrages me the most, is it's too easy to push people like that away into the corner, and then everyone else to say, oh, well, no, let's cover it all up. We don't want to dig it up. We don't want to upset the victims, and it's bullshit. Yeah. Because you are upsetting the victims.
That's right.
And there is also a huge proportion of Australians that don't buy the mainstream narrative.
Sure.
And I don't care what anyone says. If they get up there and say, oh, conspiracy theories, and, you know, sure, there'll be a huge amount of the population that will just buy the mainstream story, but I guarantee that most of those people haven't had the full story. And one of the most heartening things that I found with the Wasp Files was that when people have found the channel and gone, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Go, why didn't you know that?
Yeah. But also, I mean, in my experience as well, is that people, especially in Australia, I've noticed, tend to have these whispered conversations about these kind of events. You know, people whisper that, though, I'm not convinced about that, or I don't really buy that. You know, these conversations are kind of whispered in this country. You know, in public, you're expected to go along with the consensus story, aren't you? You know, but a lot of people, certainly in my experience, have whispered their doubts to me about this event over the years, you know, but they're very reticent to express those doubts in public, you know, because there's a social pressure, isn't there, to conform to that mainstream opinion, to, you know, I mean, there's a psychological element, isn't there? You know, there's a pressure to be in the group. You know, we're social animals, and people want to be accepted by the group. So they know they have to, at least publicly, express the opinions that the group approves of. You know, so if you start asking uncomfortable questions, we know this, you get excluded from the group. Now, some of us, and I'm talking about myself, I'm not sure about you, I don't care about being excluded from the group. In fact, I kind of welcome it, to be honest. You know, I think the group kind of stinks, and I don't really want to be part of it, you know, but a lot of people don't feel that way. and they want to be part of the group. And so there's this social pressure to go along with narratives that even they have questions about. And like I said, I've had a lot of people over the years whisper to me, I don't really buy that, blah, blah, blah. But they won't say it otherwise.
Well, Groucho Marx was famous for saying, I'll not be a member of any club that would have me as a member.
Yes.
So look, yeah, when you step outside the considered social norms of even discourse about major events that affect Australian culture.
Well, this is what this term conspiracy theory is designed to do, isn't it? It's designed to set out people who ask questions. In my view, you have an absolute right to ask questions, but that term is designed to set you outside what's acceptable. You've now alienated yourself, apparently, from what's acceptable. You've brought questions to the table that are unacceptable. I think the term, obviously the term has been clearly designed to shut down discussion and to shut down awkward opinions. And I'm now old enough to remember when what's now called conspiracy theory, I can remember when that was called politics, okay, and investigative journalism, because there was a time when it was well understood in politics that people were completely capable of scheming behind the scenes, of conspiring to further their aims or to further that power. It's actually built into our culture that people conspire to further their own ends. It's in Shakespeare. Macbeth is, just one conspiracy from start to end. Machiavelli's The Prince is like a guidebook on how to conspire to take the reins of power and to use the reins of power. It's built into our culture, this idea that, of course, people may act in secret to further their aims. And we've now got into this very strange kind of Twilight Zone era where if you raise that very obvious part of human culture, you're now what's called a conspiracy theorist, and you're now into the sort of, you put in the loony bin, basically, And I reject the whole thing.
And
Ask questions.
no powerful bastard's going to get up there and say, hey, everyone, look, I'm just going to do the dirty by you now that I've got a position of power, so this is what we're going to do. And I guess one of the things...
I would actually really appreciate that if they would do that.
Well,
I would love that.
I would say that it has changed a bit.
All strength to you.
You're right.
Lay it on the table. Let's
it's
go.
a lot more blatant now. Now they do just, in transparency, say, hey, we're going to fuck you over, Australia, and there's not much you can do about it. And people just go, okay. And I think this is one of the things that I certainly want to change or help change in our culture is where is the guts? Where is that Australian guts that we had, where we would stand up say...
I think it's been bled out of us as a culture. I think it's been done very deliberately. I think there's probably a few things, and we can talk about Port Arthur in relation to this, obviously. But I also think there's other aspects to it. I think, in my view, materialism is a great part of this. I think it's really sapped people's sort of spiritual foundations, their connection to their traditions. We've had this great, I believe, cancer of materialism sort of pushed upon us, where people, they just want to sort of consume pointless baubles and surround themselves with stuff to insulate themselves, and I think to fill the natural hole that occurs in people from their lack of spiritual connection, or their lack of whatever you want to call that, really. I think this has been deliberately pushed upon us as a society to weaken us, actually, and make us more easily controlled, and to atomize us and do all these sort of things. That's how
if we go back to Port Arthur then, we've got this wonderful little technologically and luxurious lifestyle utopia that Australia has become in the 21st century. But what happens when there is a major traumatic event, whether engineered or not, that rocks our belief system to our core? How do we react? What's your thoughts and theories about what happens to Australians when you upset the apple cart that they take for granted?
Well, the first thing that happens to them is they become afraid, okay? And it's pretty well established in psychology that when people become afraid, they gravitate towards authority because they're seeking security, okay? So people become naturally more obedient when they're afraid, okay? And another thing that happens to people when they are afraid and when they've suffered through a traumatic event, a traumatic event that is widely televised. Like obviously I remember when Port Arthur happened, you couldn't get away from it. It was everywhere. And I think this is also quite deliberate. 9/11 was the same. You couldn't get away from it. This is beamed at you from every direction. I think deliberately. Not only, as I said, does it drive you into the arms of authority, make you more obedient, but I also think it atomizes people. It separates them from their communities. They become more fearful, and that makes people become more separate, which I think also, again, makes it easier to manipulate people. If you were to see an event like Pearl Harbor as, on some level, a psychological warfare event, which I think is an entirely justifiable point of view, then it's quite understandable that an event like that would, to some degree, perhaps be designed to achieve aims like that, to atomize people and make them more easily manipulated.
Fear, control, fear, control. And we know that think tanks, way back, decades back, were very much aware of that notion of problem, reaction, solution.
Yeah.
That you've got a mass population that can be very easily controlled through fear. And if you study history and go way back, some of the ridiculous schisms that came along to shock the world were things as ridiculous as killer bees. If you remember the killer bees, we were going to be attacked by the killer bees.
Yeah.
And then it was Africanized killer bees. So there was some very interesting psychological experiments.
I've noticed that there's always, in the public domain, there's always at least one narrative at any given moment of a thing that you need to be terrified of.
Yeah.
Okay? It's Islamic terrorism, or it's the coming ice age, global cooling. I'm old enough to remember that, actually. My dad had science magazines. So there was global cooling in the 70s, Islamic terrorism, nuclear war, AIDS, bird flu,
of course.
COVID, of course. My point is, I don't think it's a coincidence that there's always at least one public narrative of something that you need to be terrified of at any given time. And I'll also note, okay, and I noticed this really strongly during the COVID era, during the COVID operation, this whole narrative which had been built up about Islamic terrorism, right? And there were bollards being put up everywhere and this whole thing. All of a sudden, the COVID operation is announced and Islamic terrorism takes
vanished off the front pages.
It took a rostered day off for 5 years.
So the terrorists went up. Well, we can't go out and plan anything because COVID's on, so we'll just sit at home twiddling our thumbs and wait for the disease to run its course.
That struck me as a pretty insightful piece of information. And okay, when I say this, I'm going to be accused of all sorts of things, okay? And it's okay, I can handle it, all right? But what that says to me is that speaks to me to some sort of level of coordination, actually. When the ISIS operation gets put on the pause button and another operation is rolled out, that says to me on some level there's some sort of coordination happening there, because I assume psychologically you can't have too many fear narratives bombarding people at the same time. They won't know who to obey and they won't know how to react, okay? And I think these narratives are about essentially herding the population into desired directions,
And then we go down that notion, of course, that events such as the Port Arthur Massacre could very well have been orchestrated because it's the perfect event to be able to enact a mass fear, certainly amongst the lackadaisical and generally relaxed Australian population, to get them fearful, to get them to turn against guns and to spurn that whole historical notion that we had that Australia was always about the great outdoors, going camping, shooting a few bunnies with your 22. We didn't have this kind of fear about firearms, and firearm homicides were on the decline prior to 1996 to Port
and
Arthur.
they were really quite rare, I remember, I think the Port Arthur event does have some what I would call very typical fingerprints of what I'm going to call intelligence operations or false flag operations or manipulated operations. There are some very obvious telltale signs around the Port Arthur tragedy that are essentially straight out of the false flag or intelligence agency playbook. We can list a few, but there's some fairly obvious ones. you'll know more about this than me, but I know that there was some sort of drill happening nearby with special forces or the police.
SACPAV, the Standing Advisory Committee on the Prevention Against Violence, counter-terrorism exercises on the Tasman Peninsula in the months before Port Arthur, which means ADF and tactical police.
So this is a typical event. Some people will know that 9/11, there were a number of drills happening on the day of the September 11 attacks. There were also on the what's known as the 7/7 attacks on the London Underground on the 7th of the 7th, 2005. What do you know? There were drills happening on that day. I remember this well. There was a guy who came forward, actually, his name was Peter Power. He worked for a group, he was ex-Scotland Yard, worked for a group, I think it was called Visor Consultants, something like this. They were running a drill on the day of the 7th, 2005 underground bomb attacks in London. They were running a drill at the exact same time, precisely at the same time, at exactly the same underground stations as the event itself, the live event itself. What this does, let's go hypothetical for a moment. If you're organising an event like Port Arthur, London, on those dates, you need to get people and material and assets into position, okay? But you need to do that undercover. So the best cover to do that is to stage a drill. Therefore, you have the perfect opportunity and the perfect cover and the perfect alibi for moving in people, moving in assets, getting situations organised. This is very typical, to have a drill that sort of accidentally goes live.
And then you've also got the resources ready and waiting to control the aftermath.
Yes.
So Christchurch, the shooting there, also had counter-terrorism drills and police and resources available. So when you look at Port Arthur, which there's a multitude of coincidences that not only suggested very strongly foreknowledge of a planned event, but also the ability to be able to control that event in the horrendous aftermath. Things like the Hobart Hospital had just implemented Code Brown, which was a procedure where the hospital could spring into action in the event of mass trauma and casualty events. They just implemented it.
So it begs the question, how many coincidences are you prepared to accept as a reasonable person? Okay? Now, you may say 2, you may say 3, but I'm going to argue when it gets to a dozen coincidences or 20 or 30 coincidences, that's too much for me to bear. As I consider myself a reasonably rational person. 2 or 3, okay, maybe, I don't know, it's looking a little bit funny, but when you're looking at dozens of coincidences and odd occurrences and anomalies, it starts to tax what might you be considered to be irrational.
And when you ask questions about those, you don't get the answers. No. You just know that these situations were in place before and after. And then, the term, I guess, that really puts paid to the notion that it's just coincidence is synchronicity, where if there's enough of events that indicate an alternative outcome to what's being told, then it's certainly worth considering that, because you go, well, everything is pointing towards this notion.
Surely, correct me if I'm wrong, but surely our aim is the pursuit of the truth. So if you are pursuing the truth, you want all the information, you want all the evidence laid out in front of you. You wouldn't dismiss any evidence, certainly not in the early stages, would you, if your aim was the pursuit of truth? Now, another thing that I remember about Port Arthur, you'll know this well, I'm sure, is that they found the alleged perpetrator, his passport in the glove box of his car. Now, you might well remember on September 11th, there was this miraculous passport that somehow survived these fireballs of these planes crashing into these buildings, and then the collapse of these buildings where things were pulverized
everything
into
to dust.
Okay, and yet there's this miraculous passport that survives. Also, on the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris, which was an alleged terrorist attack in Paris, guess what? The alleged perpetrators had their passports in the glove box of the car that the police secured near the scene, so they could be identified immediately from these passports. And it begs the question, if you truly were planning as an individual or a small group to do some sort of horrific event like this, I think bringing your ID, your photo ID or your passport along is probably going to be very, very low on your long list of priorities that you have to organize one of these horrific events. These are out of a playbook. I would suggest there is a playbook for organizing false flag
The same
events.
patterns keep repeating themselves with
Yeah.
the Christchurch massacre. Once again, surprisingly, the fire exit door in the Al Noor Mosque was locked. So, we had the same situation with Port Arthur. So, look, it's just one of those things you start to consider the patterns, the playbook, as you say,
Yeah.
that just raise suspicions. And then on top of this supposed dirge of information that then points to the guilt of the party involved, then conversely, what you've got is, yes, but we're not going to release this information and that crucial information and the hard evidence and the ballistics and the forensics. So on the one hand, you've got the story you're being fed and the supporting evidence to I guess, preserve that story. And on the other hand, you've just got, hang on, but what about this? And they're not allowed to ask questions, and it's locked down by the authorities, never to be released.
Absolutely. And connected to that, obviously, to what you're saying, is the way in what I would call false flag events, where the narrative and the guilt of the, I'm going to say, patsy, needs to be established very, very quickly. Okay. And we saw this with Port Arthur, didn't we?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember this, the headline, the full picture of Martin Bryant.
The very next day.
The next day, how is that even
This
possible?
is the man in the face of the killer.
I remember this one, the face of the killer.
Which
I
is
remember seeing
illegal.
this one.
The media just got slapped across the wrist, but that prejudiced any notion of having a trial. And interviewed an ex-newspaper support journalist who just said on the day, he said he was astounded that they had the entire story ready to go.
How
The
is that even
photographs,
possible?
the doctored photographs of where they'd raised, Martin Brown's eyebrow to make him look crazed. That was all ready to go the night, the early
So these are
evening
moments
before.
of chaos. These are moments of chaos where people understandably don't know what's happening, who's firing, who's been arrested, who's been apprehended, how many people are involved. These are moments of absolute chaos. And yet, somehow, there's this very firmly established story immediately. And I would argue it's because the people actually organising this event behind the scenes, this false flag event, know that you need to establish a narrative immediately in the mind of the public. Okay, that it needs to be established there immediately so that you can control public perception of this event. There's a very interesting story related to the Kennedy assassination. There was a guy called Fletcher Prouty, who I'm not sure if you're aware of Fletcher, but he was a Pentagon officer in the 50s and 60s. And in the early 60s, he was a liaison officer between the Pentagon and the White House. Now, on the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, Fletcher Prouty was flying with a US congressman, and he was in Christchurch, New Zealand. They just landed in Christchurch, New Zealand at the time of the assassination in Dallas, okay? And he said in one of his books, he noted that they had a stopover in Christchurch, and before midday in Christchurch, he had bought the local Christchurch paper, which had a photo of Lee Harvey Oswald and a very detailed biography of him. And if you correlate the time zone in Christchurch to the time zone in Dallas, this is before Lee Oswald has been charged. Okay.
I do remember that story very well.
They've got a photo and they've got a full biography of him, and they're saying this is the guy. Meanwhile, because of the time zone difference in Dallas, Texas, Lee Oswald has not even been charged with that crime. Okay. So how is this even possible? And the answer is this information is pre-prepared. Okay. These are pre-prepared packets of information that have been distributed, you could argue, by an intelligence agency or some equivalent network of that sort, who've prefabricated this information to control the narrative. And you see this in Port Arthur, obviously, don't you? The next day, the face of a killer.
The whole world knew that he was guilty and he hadn't even been charged. And while the media machinations to present the story were in operation that evening, the siege was still going on at Seascape Cottage. It hadn't ended until the following morning. So the machine had gone into overdrive very fast, and you'd imagine they would do so once the news broke. But the journalist that I'd spoken to said he had never seen that in his 20 plus years as a journalist, how fast that the whole machine came together. And I guess I would have...
This portrays coordination, doesn't it? It portrays coordination, because in this moment of crisis and chaos, gathering this precise information is very difficult. So it must be coordinated.
What's our message? I want to jump outside it just for a second, because the thing that part of my endeavours with the Wasp Files is to educate people on what they don't know about Port Arthur. But with regards to many aspects of what's happening with our beautiful country and the way it's governed, is how do we wake people up? How do we get them to the point where they can say, look, ask questions. Don't just blindly accept what the media will tell you, what the government will tell you. Don't fall victim to the fear control mechanism. Wake up without, being crusaders or activists, but just become aware that what we're about is to just say, as Australians, we need to grow a pair again and understand that we are the masters of our own destiny, certainly the masters of the way our country should be run. And people are waking up, but they're taking way too long to do it.
Look, I thoroughly agree with you. I think fundamentally here and in other places, I think fundamentally we have to start being adults, frankly. I think as a population, we have an infantile relationship with authority. We have an infantile relationship with our governments and the media. I think we have to really start trying to be the adults in the room. And I do think we really have to really ask fundamental questions about our relationship with government, our relationship with the media, because I think there's a plethora of evidence. Port Arthur is a good example, but there's plenty more evidence that our relationship with the government and the state is abusive, frankly, and that these institutions that we've put so much faith into, and this is, we're indoctrinated in schools and, in other places through the media and whatever, and I understand all that. But as a population, we seem to have this absurd level of trust in these institutions, which, I, for a long time, haven't had. But it appears that a lot of the population still has this, I would term it, infantile level of trust in these institutions. Daddy and mummy government will provide for me. They will look after me. They tell me that they have my best interests at heart. But let's look at the evidence. The evidence, in my view, screams at you that these institutions do not have your best interests at heart. In fact, there's plenty of evidence, and I think the last 5 years would be a very strong argument for it, amongst others, that actually there's a kind of I would call it a sort of undeclared war. In fact, I'm going all in, Paul. I think there's an undeclared war.
Should. There is a war for our very souls.
Well, there's an undeclared war, and I agree with you, but there's also an undeclared war from our governments and our media and these institutions, and there's more institutions that you can name, against the population. And I think sadly and very unfortunately at this present time, probably the majority of the population does not realise what I recognise as a fundamental truth. Actually, these institutions are at war against us, okay? And I think the last 5 years should make that plain. And I agree with you, more people are starting to ask questions, and that's great. It's not enough people, but as somebody said the other day, I was listening to somebody give a speech the other day, and they said Australians, unfortunately, are kind of wedded to comfort. Australians have been lulled into this very, for most people, not all, but for most people, very materially comfortable situation. And Australians will not do anything en masse until they're uncomfortable. So, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, unfortunately, but I do think we should and we must reject all these voices that tell you, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're crazy, blah, 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 whatever. Yeah, okay, fine, whatever, don't care. We need to ask these fundamental questions about our relationship with democracy, or whatever you want to call it, because it's clearly in my view, it doesn't function, and actually it's a fraud. I think it's an outright fraud. The will of the people is not represented. This is just a pantomime to keep people busy. I don't care.
I do care. That's the thing.
No,
Our
but I don't
freedoms
care.
have been stripped away.
Oh,
But
no,
yeah, that
absolutely.
attitude, I know what you're saying, the
Absolutely.
acquiescence.
No, I understand, but I don't care about Albanese or Dutton or whatever the latest puppet idiot of the week is. I don't care. I don't even want to identify these people by name. I'm reticent to identify them by name. I don't think they deserve it. I think they're just the latest puppet that the machine rolls out to keep you kind of involved in the...
Yeah.
A friend of mine in the States, very aptly, I think, likened it to the wrestling. You know, oh, here comes the bad guy. Oh, here's the good guy. Oh, the bad guy's got him down this week. Oh, no, the good guy's on top again. It's just like the wrestling, you know?
21st century gladiators.
Yeah, I mean, really.
But we're the poor bastards thrown to the lions.
You know, these political figures, and I'm reticent to name them because they're morons. They're just bad actors. They're just puppets. They're delivering the lines they've been given. They don't have a clue what they're doing. I'm sure they don't have a clue what's going on around them whatsoever.
There's
They're
a
just
big thing
dancing
too.
puppets.
One of the problems is the engineered division, which we're certainly seeing hitting the streets of Melbourne. So now you've got black against white, left against straight, left against right. It's just, and this is all engineered. So one of the things that I would like to address is that people such as ourselves in our era, you know, the boomers, are often then criticised by the younger generation. Now, the younger generation is desperate to stand up and fight. You know, they're very activist at the moment, but I think they've had the wool pulled over their eyes as well. So they've fallen victim to the engineered division to get them fighting people of the older generation, to come out with the notion that their view of the world is the way that things should be and they'll fight. But everyone's looking in the wrong direction.
So it's the oldest trick in the book, Paul, isn't it?
Divide
and
and
rule.
conquer.
Divide and rule. It's the oldest imperial trick in the book. You know, I've heard another analogy as well, which I think is a useful one. It's the red and the black ants. You know, you stick the red and the black ants in the jar. It's fine, whatever. You know, they're just doing their ant stuff. You shake the jar and they start attacking each other, you know, because they're like, hey, the whole thing's shaking and there's chaos and division. Oh, it must be you. Okay. It's divide and rule, you know? So, and I mean, let's be honest, we're all somewhat guilty of this, you know, because it's
We do
human
find something
psychology.
to oppose against.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I want the youth. I want their activism, their passion, their desire for change for the new world, to embrace the first thing, to question authority, to question their belief systems that may have been imposed upon them and say, well, hang on, am I really following my own passions for a new world, or am I being told what I should be railing against, and therefore, in a very controlled, sanctioned manner, going and protesting in the city? And we know there are paid protests. The whole thing's bad theatre, and there's 1,000 police officers just keeping everyone separated. Then you have these kind of sanctioned little scuffles that then the media go, wow. You know, it's all bad theatre. I want people to truly wake up, to open their minds, to question everyone, every goddamn thing, and find their own truth and reality. And with Port Arthur, it's just a starting point. There are so many attributes to our society that are signposting an orchestration of the oppression and control of Australian society from woe to go. And we need to fight against it. And I want our youth, I will leave a legacy behind for them to take the baton and carry on. And that's what it's about. Asking questions, disputing, not just blindly joining that party or this group or that group. That has been engineered.
I completely agree with you. I think, unfortunately, we are, as I've alluded to, we're in the middle of a psychological warfare event. I think this has become fairly obvious in a lot of ways, you know. And I think a psychological warfare event, much like a false flag event, like, you know, Port Arthur and numerous others, has multiple levels. Okay, so the manipulations go on multiple levels. So I know that we're all guilty of it, but I do think, to greater or lesser degrees, we're all being manipulated. You know, we're all being wedged against each other. I think that this manipulation goes from very overt to quite subtle, you know. So I do think it's valuable for all of us to question our assumptions, exactly as you're saying, you know, our assumptions, And I think in a place like Australia and many other places, we have a lot of things to be angry about. This country is in a very poor state of affairs.
Yes, it is.
And I think that this has been a long time coming. I think this is largely deliberately engineered. I think Australia is heading for some sort of collapse unless something changes. So people, especially young people, have a lot to be angry about. Unfortunately, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them exist in this environment that we all do. That's a highly manipulated environment. We're all given these sort of pre-packaged, prefabricated causes and things to get angry and animated about. I do think all of us could benefit from pulling back a little bit and going, okay, what's the real cause of our problems? What is the root of our real problems? And who or what group or groups are behind our real problems? Let's pull out a bit. I always think it's really useful exercise, and I try and do this as much as I can, is to try and pull out and have a look at the big picture. So let's make the assumption, I'll make the assumption anyway, that Port Arthur is some sort of engineered event. It's a false flag event of some kind, okay? That's an assumption that I'm making. I think there's a multitude of evidence that suggests that, as we've discussed. There's all sorts of telltale signs. If you make that assumption, and I certainly am, let's pull back from that a little bit, okay? What sort of people, or what sort of groups of people would organize such an event, and why would they do it? Okay, let's pull out, the details are useful. You've done great work in this area, absolutely. But let's pull out for a moment. Why would that happen? What groups of people would benefit from an event like that, and why would they aim to carry it out? I think these are really important questions. I don't know if you want to go there or not. Obviously, the choice is yours.
I have, and
these are
the bigger questions that
Why?
I guess from a positive point of view, because it's very easy to be negative about our country and the freedoms that we've taken for granted that no longer seem to be in place, is that the vision for the future of Australia and Australians should be that we are the engineers of our own renewal, of our own control over the kind of country that we want to be, the kind of people we want to be, and the way we want to be governed. We have that power. And the cynics will say, oh, well, we don't, but you do. And the notion, the best notion to achieve that is to be like a terrier on a rat, never let go. That you stand up for your rights, that you harass, harangue, and worry the powers that have controlled the whole game until they cannot ignore you anymore. It doesn't mean that you have to condone any form of violence, but we need to make the Australia that we want it to be, not what they want us to be or what the United Nations wants us to be or some huge governing cabal. We are the engineers of our own freedoms, and that's what I really want to espouse, is the future is there for us to grab. And the people that don't have our best interests at heart, the people that you talk about that in essence have orchestrated events going way back through centuries, but certainly, in my opinion as well, Port Arthur, are the ones that we need to focus our attentions on and make very, very uncomfortable. And
Yes.
That's my whole plan as well.
Yeah, and look, I totally agree. And for people who would say, oh, Port Arthur, it's almost 30 years ago now. Who cares? Blah blah blah. I would argue the complete opposite of that. As we said at the beginning, I think it's important to honour the victims of those events. They deserve our respect, and I think respect means the pursuit of truth. But I also think traumatic events like that, they're like ripples in a pond. They send ripples through the fabric of society. And I think Port Arthur has sent great ripples through Australian society. I think it has weakened Australian society, as we've alluded to. I think it was deliberately, in part, designed to do that. And I want to ask the question, okay, so what sort of person or what sort of group would do such a thing, would extinguish people's lives in the most horrible way? Children, families, horrible deaths, really unimaginably bad, horrible deaths. What sort of people or groups would do that? And what are their aims? And what should our relationship be? Because and it's just my view, I don't think you can pin an event like Port Arthur, for example, on the whole of the government. I think that's irrational. For me, where I get to with that situation is, I think the picture I get from that situation is that, okay, behind this thing called the government, which is just this sort of dumb thing, there must be another group, I would assume, behind this thing that uses government to achieve its aims. Well, I view government as a sort of an empty rubber glove, a framework, a thing that can be manipulated, and a barrier, sort of like an air gap between the population, who there are certain, individuals and groups that want to manipulate the population, want to control the population. And in between them, there's this stupid thing called government, which those groups will use like a hand occupies a glove to manipulate situations and to frighten and cower and organize and cull the population and make them do what they want. And I think if we look at that realistically, we've got to really ask about our relationship with power and authority and government. What do we want from this thing?
And why don't we have enough of it of our own power?
Sure.
I mean, the stopgap control mechanisms of government are all about greed. So what they get out of the deal is money, power, prestige, influence, and they happily have their strings pulled, or puppeteers' hands up their asses, because they benefit. The rest of us will suffer economically, culturally, politically, psychologically. But the elite, of course, they live off the purviews of a very privileged life.
They've got their sort of, politician media clown show to shield them from scrutiny. Because the last thing they want, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The last thing people who have great power want is the rays of sunlight on them. They do not want to be observed in their, in my view, evil machinations, okay? So they want this stupid clown show of politicians and various idiots and the media's sideshow.
It's all bad theatre.
Yeah, it is. To obscure what's really going on. And I think as horrendous as an event like Pearl Harbor is, and it's a shocking, horrific, tragic event, possibly one of the only good things that come out of an event like that, which is horrific, is it's a moment where the curtain opens slightly and we get a better view of the reality of our situation, I believe. And the reality of our situation, in my view, is that we do have these powers who use government, use the media to control us. They don't care about killing innocent people. They don't care about them having horrific deaths. They don't care about lying about it. They don't care about any of those things. To them, we are just cattle. Yeah, we're fodder. We're cattle. They're the ranchers of the ranch. That's an analogy I use sometimes. The rancher goes, well, I need to cull some of the herd, or I need to frighten the herd to move them into a different paddock. Whatever I do, they're just cattle. So I think we really need to be honest about this. We really need to sort of grow up, as you said, be a bit more adult about it, and realize that this relationship that we have through this nexus of government and media is actually an abusive relationship where powerful people treat the population as, pawns on a chessboard or cattle to be done with and disposed of as they see fit. I think
we need to understand our own power, our own freedom, our own rights are there for the taking. Mm-hmm. And we just need to step up to the plate and take them, because otherwise, as we've seen, it will be taken away from us.
Yes.
I want to thank you for coming on the Wasp Files. It's been a bit of a philosophical discussion about Port Arthur, but we've delved, specifically into the events ad infinitum over the last 9 months or so, and I'll still do that. But what we're about here is getting people to wake up. I'm not a crusader. I'm not an activist. I want Australians to be Australians, and I want us to understand that our governments are bastards. Our media are just the lowest form of life.
Well, they're collaborators. I call them the collaborator class.
Yeah,
actually,
they serve a purpose, but that purpose certainly doesn't serve the purpose of the Australian people.
No.
So that's what we're all about. But thanks again for coming on, David.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And keep fighting the good fight, as I will. And is it about truth? Is it about finding finding out who was responsible? I doubt we'll ever find that out. But as I said, I'm not going to let this government off the hook.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
It's appreciated.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Wasp Files. New episodes will be uploaded every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Feel free to share far and wide, and please see the links to the Dropbox files and information relating to the episodes. Also, without any obligation, please see the Buy Me a Coffee campaign, which helps keep the channel running and also provides profits to my friends who are survivors from Port Arthur who have supported me on this journey. Thank you.